Let me give the intro on Jay and then we can get started. So Jay is the founder of OpenCode. OpenCode is an open source AI coding agent. They built an open source coding harness and they also host open source coding models. We are proud seed investors alongside YC. I don't want to share too much, but it's safe to say OpenCode is having a moment. They launched 6 months back and they are over 2 million users now and just phenomenal traction in the last 6 months. And I think that they're building a very important company in the open source ecosystem. Let's get started, Jay. For people new to the company, what is OpenCode building and what's the company mission?
Yeah, so OpenCode is an open source coding agent that works with every single model and provider. We have an application that's primarily, at least these days, on the terminal, but we've got something that's on the desktop as well. The goal is to make sure that as a developer and as a company that builds software, we're able to build an agent that works across the board. So not just what a developer uses sort of day to day, but also something that fits into the other parts of their software development workflow. And so, whether that's sort of integrating with GitHub or being in Slack or Discord, or just building even like custom internal tools, just want to make sure that we have a way for developers to sort of be able to do that in a sort of an open source way, but also give them the choice of using any model, any provider, whether that's sort of internal, external, or even locally hosted.
Awesome. Code is exploding, especially with AI. In 10 years, do you think the coding market revenue would be 100 billion, 500 billion, or a trillion?
Here's the bigger the better. But yeah, I think it will be fundamentally large. I guess the sort of non-rapid fire version of this answer would be, I think what's happening here is that, obviously these things are sort of generating code and that makes sense on its own. But what some of these harnesses and some of these products are doing is that they're taking that and then essentially driving tooling. So you're giving it access and you're saying, the LLM says, do this, and then this thing goes out and actually does that thing, and then gives the sort of response or the output back to the LLM, and then the LLM gets to do sort of more things. What that essentially means is that it allows people to build not just like pure code generation tools, but also tools that can do work. And I think that's fundamentally why we're probably going to see revenues maybe that are outside of the scope of just, pure software development. Or I guess the way somebody has sort of put it to me in the past was, the addressable market here isn't necessarily developers, but it is how much we spend on software development as a whole, which by some metric, you could almost make the claim that, sort of coding is maybe one of the largest professions in the world also. So you sort of look at it from that perspective, and yeah, some of these numbers actually make sense. But to be honest, after a certain range, it becomes kind of hard to sort of contextualize.
These numbers don't make sense. Before we go into the company journey and the market, maybe for folks new to this, maybe educate us about what's happening in the open source coding models and why should we all be taking it a lot more seriously?
Yeah, it's funny because I think when we had first started, so we had launched in sort of middle of June last year, and the premise back then was Claude Code is great. Clearly something's happened with the Sonnets of the world, the Opuses of the world, where it can now write code without, too much sort of human intervention. This is obviously back then. Now it's even more so. But it wasn't clear that you could build an open source model that would maybe be up to par with that. So the assumption was always sort of that, like, you're always going to want the smartest engineer in the room, the engineer here being, let's say, the LLM. You're going to want the smartest version of these models. However, I think over the last few months, what sort of happened is that we've come to understand that because the market and the ecosystem is so large, you're probably going to have diverse use cases or flavors of these models. So, today, when we look at some of these open source models that are performing really well, of course, there's like the cost characteristic. This is sort of very reminiscent of when you were hire engineers. You would be like, well, you could hire somebody from the Valley, or, there are like a lot of other countries that you can sort of hire from. They were way sort of cheaper. So maybe there's a cost characteristic here, but there's also fundamentally some of these open source models are a little bit faster. They're a little bit more fun to work with. And so what we're kind of seeing is that it was maybe the initial premise was you're looking for the smartest thing. Now maybe we're starting to recognize in some ways, some of these things are smart enough, and then they're seeing some of these other characteristics that end up mattering. And that's what I think the open source ecosystem is filling the gaps into. And then if you just sort of zoom out, you can kind of think it's very hard for a frontier lab to try and address every single use case. Clearly, somebody's going to be more motivated to go after a specific use case or a specific flavor than the other. And I think that's what we're sort of seeing. So generally speaking, just greater diversity leading to a lot more of these sort of use cases being explored. And I think that just sort of points in a direction that it's hard to say that it would sort of reverse course somehow. So we should probably take it seriously because I think this is probably the way things are going to be.
I think one of the interesting observations I've always observed is that Silicon Valley, especially with the models, tends to really think about closed source models, and the rest of the world thinks about open source models. The vibe shift in Silicon Valley that it's all about closed source foundation models, and the rest of the world is talking about open source. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is, and I think there's some good reasons for this. I think with the initial sort of burst of these things, every time you see a model step up, you get this sensation that we're getting closer to something. And this is obviously, the sort of AGI thing that everybody obviously refers to. But every time you have that, it changes your perspective on what could be. And of course, in the Valley, I think we value to a very high degree the ability of a new technology to disrupt some existing sort of assumptions about the world. And so every model step up is basically starting to challenge that. And I think on some level, like, we're enamored with the fact that, this is what the goal is. The goal is to get to this like extremely smart, like sort of general intelligence. And that's maybe the best the best way to sort of do that is through sort of a closed ecosystem, because, obviously, at least on the Anthropic side, they, strongly believe that there are sort of safety considerations if you're going to be going in that direction. And I think that bias has sort of led to this other gap forming, which is, hey, the rest of the world maybe can do a lot of work, even with maybe not the greatest of intelligences in one of these models. And I think that bias has probably like led to this sort of gap. And again, speaks to just like the diversity of the ecosystem. It's not to say that one side is sort of wrong or the other. It's just that when you're dealing with a very large market with all of these sort of diverse use cases, it's going to be very hard to capture everything. And I think that's probably what we're sort of seeing.
Yeah, OpenCode has people who still would bring the Anthropic API keys, Codex API keys. So people are using both the closed source models and the open source models in the harness. You have a front row seat to this revolution. What is overhyped today about coding models and what's underhyped?
Yeah. And this is specifically, I think, in North America, or in the West at least, is that there's a general sort of idea of like more tokens equals more intelligence, and the sort of smarter the model, the better it sort of is, which, again, there's obviously sort of merits to that. But I think that leads to sort of the hype, which is we want to live on the frontier, so badly that we tend to overhype some of these things. And I think what's been crazy is that if you sort of zoom out and you look at some of these sort of model launches, they're maybe not that differentiated, especially over the last couple of months. And I think what's sort of being underhyped is the fact that, people are beginning to use some of these other models in situations that are maybe not that talked about because it's maybe not that visible, or maybe it's not that sexy, or maybe it's not, it doesn't grab the headlines. So the underhyped part is really coming, I think, from some of these open source models and the way they're sort of being used, especially globally. Yeah.
It's clear that the role of a software developer will change, and there are different worldviews. There are people who take the more extreme worldview that programmers are dead, and maybe the more moderate worldviews that the job completely changes. Concretely, call it, in a reasonable time frame of 2 or 3 years, like concretely, what are the big things that software developers will be doing very differently than what they're doing today?
Yeah, I think there are a few different things. The obvious one, sort of looking at the software development sort of life cycle. Obviously, on the prototyping side, it's very clear that we should probably be doing way more exploration. So let's take an example of sort of a company that is building a product. Because the cost of prototyping used to be at least, done sort of manually, is relatively high, we tend to prefer doing, sort of wireframes. We tend to prefer doing, low-tech versions of these sort of prototypes. And that, I think, should fundamentally, with what's happened, lead to a sort of a shift in that we should be willing to try out a lot more sort of prototypes. So just sort of the initial part of the software development, that sort of applies. Then I think in the actual implementation itself, there's probably a question. This is maybe where I think, at least at OpenCode, we sort of believe that maybe people are getting a little bit carried away here. Products that you use on a daily basis, you still care about a certain level of quality. And if the LLM is not meeting that bar, the person still fundamentally needs to be involved. So when I think about the actual implementation of the product, I think sort of very good quality products will still be done with a human in the loop fundamentally. Even though, again, from the outside, it might look like you could ship a very high quality product. That's a little bit different from when somebody starts using it and they begin to feel that, hey, this is actually not built that well. Human beings are very good at telling that apart on some level. And then finally, there's this other aspect, is that when we think about sort of testing and rolling it out to sort of broader environments, this is where I think you can sort of use LLMs to quite a high degree as well, which is there's just, when you sort of think about your product is now being used a lot, it's being used in all of these sort of edge cases or all these sort of environments. It's fundamentally annoying and sort of painful to go out and test and fix all of those things. Now that is a thing that is a little bit more addressable. And so maybe the sort of slight version here is that there's a bunch of grunt work in the entire process you could probably take out pretty quickly. The high quality work probably should still be done by a human in the loop. But yeah, some of this is still up for, up to change.
Yeah, the top 1% will just have to be more in the top 1%.
Yeah.
A lot of startups here are building on top of LLMs. And this is an existential question I think every startup has to think through. There are two worldviews. One is the labs building the models and own the intelligence layer, and therefore will win the application layer with more focus. There's another worldview, which a lot of us here believe at Peak 15, is that there will be multiple models, there'll be more competition in the future, switching costs are very low for models, and therefore startups have a structural advantage to win the application layer. It's an open question, there are no right answers, but how do you think about, what are your mental model assumptions as you think about this industry question for the next 10 years?
Yeah. It's fascinating because it's like, I think sometimes when we talk about the model companies, we think that, especially as, let's say, a startup that's sort of building an application, you kind of put them on a pedestal going, hey, they're building this incredible thing, they get to dictate sort of the market, they get to dictate the pace of the world because, the world sort of marches to the beat of their model releases. But in reality, the degree of competition that they face at that layer is just incredibly high. So the competition at the model layer makes it so that, when I kind of think about this question, they just have so much to deal with just on its own that for them to pick, let's say, a specific application and go after that and build a high quality product, it's a very hard task. And that's nothing to say about the fact that even, the sort of domain expertise required to build a good application, is a lot more sort of underrated in circumstances like this because people are kind of thinking, hey, the LLM can do everything. And so that's the way I sort of look at this, is that there are certain products where the user experience, and if your user is a human being, matters so much that you being able to execute really well for that use case will set you apart because, again, the model labs just have a lot to worry about on their hands. When you think about some of the application layer launches that some of the model labs do, some of them do end up sort of sticking because there are some advantages to being, like Claude Code, I think is a good example of this, obviously in our space, is that, we're building, so say we sort of Anthropic, we're building the Claude models. Here is at least the way we recommend you use our Claude models. That default positioning is worth a lot, but that doesn't necessarily, at least in our case, directly translate to at least what we think would be a really good product. So when we sort of compete at that layer, we're trying to build the best product possible because the bar for a developer that uses your product every single day is quite high. And so that's fundamentally where the competition is, at least for us. And again, if you sort of zoom out, the model labs have a lot of other things to sort of compete on as well.
Yeah, maybe let's switch gear to the OpenCode journey. So fun fact, so OpenCode is a company started in 2011.
Yeah.
The fun fact is Jay has been building open source projects since 2011, went through YC in 21, and pivoted into this 6 months back when they really took off. I've seen a lot of companies. I've seen a lot of tenacious founders, but I've seen founders start companies, go back to a job, and then come back. You've been at the same company at it for very long. And I think you shared this quote, one of your angel investors, Max Lefton, the founder of PayPal, one of your angel investors said, I think you've been 3 months away from running out of money for the last 10 years.
Yes.
And here you are now. How do you do it?
Yeah, it's funny he said that because like our monthly investor updates, you usually you put down like, oh, this is how much we have in the bank, this is how much we're burning, hence we're gonna run out of money in this much time, and it wasn't quite 10 years, but it was like for a period of a while that number, the 3-month number, never changed because we were working so hard at like we should make a little bit more money and cut a little bit more costs, and eventually it'll sort of even out, and then you keep doing that. And the idea is that at some point you kind of like hit default alive sort of pace, and ended up kind of working out for us. Obviously, I think it came down to the last month for us, but I think when I kind of look at this a little bit, because I'd gotten some questions about this recently about with OpenCode, it felt like we sort of launched it and kind of worked right away. The story behind it on some level is that I could pinpoint to almost every single thing that contributed, at least that we think contributed to OpenCode's sort of initial success. And I can point that back to something that we sort of learned. And when I think about personally, I think I am pretty stubborn, so it's probably not the smartest thing to do. You should probably go work for the high growth startup at some point and learn a bunch of things and come back and do your own thing. But B, I think for me, it felt like there was always something that I wanted to learn, that I understood about the world as a result of what we sort of built. And then there was this other thing that didn't quite make sense that I wanted to sort of learn. And that kind of kept us going on some level. And so we built a bunch of different products. We were sort of going back. We had done consumer for a little while. We had done sort of SaaS for a little while as well. We had obviously done open source. And OpenCode sort of feels like a culmination of all of those things on some level. There are elements of like what we had learned from the consumer world that heavily applies to the product. Obviously, the SaaS and the open source stuff is pretty relevant with the sort of the business model in general. But yeah, it's a lot to learn.
I mean, you're clearly the open source guy now. A lot of people here are open source.
Nice.
What's fundamentally different about building an open source project that's so different from running a normal company?
Yeah, I think we sort of talked offline about this one, but I think people still don't recognize the value in open source. If you just take a step back for a second, open source, in terms of just collaborating amongst large number of human beings, is a fundamental sort of upgrade in the way we do things as I guess like a civilization. And it's so weird because if you step back and you think about it, any sort of technological device that you're sort of using is built on something open source, and that's because somebody decided to take some of their free time and work on a thing that probably has no monetary value. And that in itself is obviously absurd. It makes no sense. You don't see that in a lot of other professions. Maybe that speaks to the fact that software development is pretty easy to do, maybe. But fundamentally, it's built on a premise that is very counterintuitive. What that's led to on some level, I think, and this is where it makes sense to build companies on top of this, because there's sort of second order effects of this initial idea of people donating their time, is that when people start to collaborate on, let's say, a certain, like a given project, let's say it's an open source project, and they're making sure that it starts to work, in every sort of environment, every sort of setup possible for every single use case possible, now all of a sudden that has a lot of strategic value. That becomes a moat that turns that open source project into a standard on some level. And standards, once sort of established, end up kind of dictating what gets built on top of it. So you think about the most sort of popular open source projects in the world, they achieve this status where it becomes foundational for software that is built on top of it, or companies that are built on top of it, or people that get hired because of it. And when you get to that sort of level, now all of a sudden that is a business asset that, of course, you probably won't be directly monetizing, because open source is a little bit tricky to monetize on, but it gives you a platform to build on top of, which has incredible lasting value. So it can go from anywhere from 5 to sort of 15 years. And that's fundamentally what we're sort of looking for when we're building companies, or at least generational companies, is you're looking to build an asset that can stand the test of time. Open source probably happens to be one of the best ways to sort of do that, at least in software.
Cool. We are running again out of time, so unfortunately we can't do audience questions. But one last question from me: 10 years from now, when we're chatting, what do you think OpenCode becomes?
I hope it's a thing that people are using to build on top of, and it ends up becoming a part of their toolkit, aside from the sort of day-to-day use case, which I think is fairly important. If we assume that LLMs are sort of here to stay, and you kind of need an application that can drive, a machine or whatever off of what the LLM sort of says, then that sort of core agent loop ends up being valuable. And our hope is that OpenCode sort of establishes itself as a standard for doing that, across all models, across all providers, across all environments.
Well, thank you, Jay, and congrats on all the progress in the last 6 months.